The telegraph carried the words of empires and families, of merchants and generals, yet for the person seated at the machine, it was a life of endless clicking, long hours, and little reward. We will begin by imagining the daily world of the operator. From there, we'll step into a larger story of ambition. Then explore some of the mysteries hidden in codes and messages, and finally contrast that quiet labor with the lives of those who reaped its benefits. So let your breathing slow, and picture yourself at the desk of a 19th century telegraph office. The office is small, its walls bare, its furniture plain and wooden. On the desk sits the telegraph key, a small brass lever mounted on a block of wood, polished smooth by countless hands. Beside it, a strip of paper is ready to unspool, waiting to capture the endless sequence of dots and dashes. The sound defines your day. A steady clicking fills the room. Not music, not silence, but something in between. It is constant, repetitive, and inescapable. Your hand hovers over the key, pressing and releasing in rhythm, while your eyes strain to follow each mark on the tape. The hours stretch long. In large stations, shifts often run for 12 hours or more. Meals are taken at the desk, tea cooling between bursts of signals. The chair beneath you grows harder the longer you sit, and the air carries the faint, acrid smell of heated metal and oil. Outside, carriages rattle by on cobblestones, but inside, the clicking continues, unbroken. Your pay is modest, though messages of war and peace, of wealth and loss, pass directly through your hands. You are not permitted to profit from them. Others speculate and grow rich. You remain the messenger, bound to accuracy and speed. Any mistake, even a single misplaced dot or dash, could mean confusion, financial harm, or disappointment for those waiting at the other end. Day after day, the rhythm continues. The clock ticks. The machine clicks. Your back stiffens, your eyes blur, but still you keep pace. It is not dramatic work. It is not glamorous. It is repetition, duty, and quiet endurance. And in that steady rhythm, the endless click of the telegraph, life slowly passes for the 19th century operator. As we step away from the dim telegraph office, we find ourselves in a world of far larger ambition. In the middle of the 19th century, visionaries and engineers began to imagine something unprecedented. A single wire that could connect Europe and North America stretched quietly beneath the vast Atlantic Ocean. At the time, a message sent across the ocean could take weeks, carried only by ship. The idea of sending it in minutes seemed almost magical. And yet it was precisely this dream that men such as Cyrus Westfield devoted themselves to. He was not an engineer by training, but a wealthy American businessman who saw both profit and progress in the possibility of a transatlantic line. The challenges were immense. The ocean was thousands of miles wide, and its depths remained largely unmapped. The cable itself had to be strong enough to survive the laying, flexible enough to coil, and insulated well enough to resist the constant weight of water pressing down upon it. The ships of the day were barely adequate for the task. Spools of heavy cable were loaded into their holds, and as the vessels set out from Ireland or Newfoundland, the cable uncoiled slowly, sinking mile after mile into the dark water below. The first attempts ended in disappointment. A cable laid in 1858 transmitted a few messages, celebrated with much ceremony and prayer, only to fail after just 3 weeks of use. The copper cores weakened, the insulation broke down, and silence returned. Newspapers that had hailed the triumph quickly turned to criticism, calling it a costly folly. The operators who sat ready at their machines found themselves listening to dead wires once again. But failure did not stop the effort. Through the 1860s, engineers refined their designs, thickening the insulation, improving the copper, and learning how to feed the line into the sea without damaging it. New ships were built or converted for the task, the most famous being the massive Great Eastern, one of the largest vessels of its age, whose cavernous holds could carry thousands of miles of cable in a single voyage. Finally, in 1866, the dream was achieved. The line was laid successfully, stretching from Ireland to Newfoundland. The world was, for the first time, joined by a slender thread of metal and gutta percha. Messages that once took weeks by ship could now pass in minutes, a quiet revolution in communication. For the operator at his desk, this meant a new kind of pressure. Now he might receive a message from across the ocean itself, a fragile sequence of dots and dashes that had traveled through the dark and crushing waters of the Atlantic. The responsibility was heavy, and the margin for error grew even smaller. But the work remained the same, sitting, listening, and tapping back replies. It is worth pausing to imagine that contrast. Outside, the world was celebrating one of the greatest engineering feats of the century, a link that brought continents together. Yet inside the telegraph office, the operator's life changed very little. The chair was just as hard, the lamp just as dim, and the endless clicking just as steady. The glory belonged to the engineers and financiers. The operator, the victory, meant only more messages, more hours, and more repetition. And so the Atlantic cable became part of daily life, humming quietly beneath the ocean while operators across the world carried out their small, repetitive tasks. Each tap of the key seemed mundane, yet together they formed the pulse of a newly connected world. If the daily life of an operator was defined by repetition, there was still a layer of intrigue hidden within the signals that passed through their hands. For much of the 19th century, the telegraph was not simply a tool of communication, it was also a tool of secrecy. Messages often needed to be disguised, shortened, or encoded. In this world, telegraphic codes and ciphers became both practical necessity and subtle mystery. At its simplest, the problem was cost. Telegraph companies charged by the word, and words could be expensive when sent across long distances, especially across oceans. To save money, businesses developed code books, volumes filled with single words that stood in for entire phrases or sentences. A word like armadillo might mean shipment delayed, while pearl could mean send payment. Immediately, these codebooks filled thousands of pages, carefully indexed so that clerks and operators could compress an entire conversation into just a handful of words. For the operator, it was a peculiar experience. You would sit at your desk, tapping out what looked like a list of unrelated words. Candle, horizon, velvet. To you, they were meaningless. But for the merchant at the other end, opening his code book, they carried instructions that might shift markets or direct entire ships. It was a strange reminder of how much of the world's business passed through your fingers without you ever being fully aware of it. There were also codes designed not just for economy, but for secrecy. Governments used the telegraph to send dispatches about wars, treaties, and intelligence. Spies relied on the lines as much as merchants did. Messages might be disguised in numeric ciphers, or blended into harmless-looking texts, intelligible only to those who held the key. An operator might suspect something unusual, but could rarely prove it. The role was not to question, only to transmit. Some mysteries emerged from this coded world. In archives today, historians sometimes uncover bundles of old telegrams written in code books that have been lost. The messages remain opaque, strings of words that once carried urgency, now reduced to riddles without answers. What did cypress, lantern, indigo mean to the recipient? Was it a commercial order, or perhaps something more? Unless the matching codebook is found, the meaning has vanished into silence. Even among ordinary people, the telegraph inspired creativity. Lovers used it to send secret messages, cloaking their feelings in playful codes, so that operators would not raise an eyebrow. Families used simple substitutions to disguise private matters from curious eyes along the way. In the endless clicking of the machine, a faint human warmth persisted, hidden behind dots and dashes. For operators, however, this layer of mystery rarely brought excitement. It was simply part of the flow. One moment you might transmit a telegram about a shipment of wheat, the next a coded dispatch from a government office, and the next a brief message of love disguised as numbers. The duty was always the same: accuracy, speed, and endurance. And so the telegraph became a channel not just for news, but for secrets. Some of those secrets we can still unravel today. Others remain mysteries, locked forever in strings of words that no longer have meaning. For the operator, though, they were all alike. Just more clicks, more marks on the paper tape, and another hour in the chair. While the operator endured long hours in the dim light of a cramped office, others experienced the telegraph in a very different way. For the wealthy and powerful, the arrival of a telegram was an event in itself, a sign that they stood at the center of a world newly tied together by wires and signals. Imagine a grand Victorian drawing room, with tall windows draped in heavy curtains. the air faintly scented by coal fires and polished wood. On the table rests a silver tray where letters are usually placed, and beside them, a folded telegram envelope marked with urgency. A servant delivers it, not with the ink-stained fingers of the operator who tapped it out, but with gloved hands, part of the refined routine of the household. For merchants and financiers, telegrams carried opportunities. Prices on distant exchanges, news of ships arriving or delayed, or sudden developments in political affairs could mean profit or loss. A single cable might shift investments, alter contracts, or spark a rush of buying and selling. Those who had access to the telegraph, and the money to use it freely, were able to act faster than ever before. Wealth traveled along the wires as surely as words did. For families of means, the telegraph brought reassurance and convenience. Son studying abroad could send word of his safe arrival in days rather than weeks. News of illness, recovery, or celebration could travel swiftly across continents. While expensive, the telegram became a tool of connection that only the well-off could afford regularly. For them, the cost was simply part of life's comfort, while for the poor, it remained a rare and sometimes unattainable luxury. Governments and the military also stood on the privileged side of this new world. In the halls of power, telegrams arrived in stacks, each one carrying intelligence, instructions, or reports from distant fronts. Leaders could command troops and negotiate diplomacy with a speed unimaginable only a generation earlier. Though wars and rivalries still raged, the flow of information grew steadier, and decision-making became ever more reliant on those steady clicks of the key. It is striking to imagine the contrast. The operator in his chair, weary-eyed, listening to the monotonous rhythm, compared to the merchant in his well-lit office, the minister in his chamber, or the matron in her drawing room. All of them depended on the same messages, the same signals carried through wires, but their experience of the telegraph was utterly different. For some, it was toil. For others, it was advantage. In this way, the telegraph became more than a technology. It was a mirror of society itself, reflecting the divisions of labor and privilege. One group lived within the sound of the key, bound to its relentless rhythm. Another used the messages to build fortunes, expand empires, or simply rest more easily at night. And as the century progressed, this divide remained. The operator's chair stayed uncomfortable. The elite's telegrams continued to arrive on silver trays. The wire humming quietly across towns, continents, and oceans bound them all together in a web of information, though in very unequal ways. With this contrast in mind, we are ready to step back and close our journey. In the conclusion, we will reflect gently on the life of the telegraph operator and what their quiet, unseen work left behind in the world we know today. And so we come to the end of our quiet journey through the world of the 19th century telegraph. We began in the operator's cramped office, where the steady clicking of the key defined long, weary hours. We followed the grand ambition of those who stretched a cable across the ocean, turning weeks of silence into minutes of connection. We explored the strange world of codes and secrets, where meaning often slipped into mystery. And finally, we contrasted the operator's life of repetition with the drawing rooms and offices of those who enjoyed the privileges the telegraph brought. What remains most striking is the contrast between visibility and invisibility. The world celebrated the cables, the financiers, the statesmen, and the merchants. Yet it was the operator, seated quietly at the desk, who made every connection possible. Their names were not remembered, their work seldom praised. But without their patience and precision, the wires would have been silent. Tonight as you rest, you might imagine that steady rhythm once more. The soft click of the key, like a metronome marking time. Hour after hour, year after year, lives and histories pass through those signals. Now, the wires are mostly gone, replaced by satellites and fiber optics, but the story of their sound remains. It is a reminder that history is not only made in great halls or on battlefields. Often it is carried out in small rooms by quiet people doing repetitive work unseen yet essential. The telegraph operator lived in that space between silence and connection, between invisibility and necessity. As you close your eyes, you can let that thought fade gently. The world around you now is quiet. The messages can wait. The wires no longer call. You are at rest, and unlike the weary operator of the past, your task is only to drift peacefully into sleep.